everyone. Thanks for having us tonight. My name is Jessica Frank. I work at the Intercommunity Justice and Peace Center, which is a tongue twister, and we refer to ourselves with IJPC, which is our acronym, and that's also a tongue twister that people get confused all the time. But we are a nonprofit located in Over the Rhine in the Peasley Neighborhood Center. If anybody knows where that is, it's right behind Ziegler Park. And our mission is to educate and advocate for peace, challenge local, national, and global unjust systems, and promote a more nonviolent society. And so we do that through 4 different program areas. We have an immigration program. Hazel is a part of our Youth Educating Society program, and she will talk a little bit about that soon. And then we have a human trafficking program, and I manage our death penalty program and our peace and nonviolence program. So 4 different issue areas, but all linked in different ways, and all important work. So I'm going to be quick and talk about, I don't know, I'm used to having a PowerPoint or something behind me, and I'm just turning around. But I am going to give a really brief update on what's going on with the death penalty in Ohio. And if you've been reading the news, you know that a lot has been happening. And if you don't, that's fine too, because I will go through it all. I think Sister Andrea Koverman came last year and did some education about the history of the death penalty in Ohio. And so if anyone has questions about that, if you weren't here last time, I'd be happy to go through that, but I didn't really prepare a whole lot on the history. I just wanted to talk about where we are and where we're going. So some brief history for those of you who don't know a whole lot about the death penalty. When we talk about the modern death penalty in the United States, we're talking about post-1972, which is after the Furman decision that the Supreme Court came out with, which struck down the death penalty. After that, states across the country either didn't bring the death penalty back, or they had to work to create a new code in their state that the Supreme Court would find constitutional. And so Ohio was actually in the process of rewriting their criminal code at the time when the Furman decision was happening. And so they were like, oh, this is perfect. We can just rewrite a new death penalty statute into our code. And so we had a new death penalty law on the books by 1974, which was 2 years after the decision. But we didn't have our first execution until 1999. So since then, Ohio has had 56 executions. I think a good chunk of them happened in just a short span of time, and so we were oftentimes called the Texas of the North, because Texas is the highest executing state. And if you look at a map, I don't have a PowerPoint, but if you look at a map, you can see that we are definitely an outlier in the North with 56 executions. We have the 8th highest execution rate in the country and the 7th largest death row. Currently, there's 136 people on Ohio's death row. And to dive into where we're at right now, so in modern history, so we'll talk about Governor Kasich, and now Governor DeWine has done some really interesting things. Governor Kasich, there was a 3-year moratorium, which just essentially means an unofficial pause on the death penalty for 3 years. So between 2014 and 2017, there were no executions in the state of Ohio, and that was because of they were trying to find a new lethal injection protocol to use to perform executions, and they were having challenges finding drugs for those executions, and so that's why there was this 3-year break. And so the first execution happened in July 2017, and executions only occurred for 1 year. So there were 3 executions between July 2017 and July 2018 until executions stopped again. And so Kasich ended up commuting the sentences of the next 2 people after July 2018, and then he left office. And so in January of this year, Governor DeWine came into office, and the death penalty wasn't something that he explicitly ran on. I'm not sure that he mentioned it much, if at all. I don't think at all when he was running, but 11 days into his term, he made the death penalty kind of one of the first big decisions that he made. So yes, he is pro-life. Yeah, so he's conservative. He is pro-life, but that is kind of an anomaly. A lot of pro-lifers are also pro-death penalty, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense sometimes. And so Governor DeWine, there was to cut a lot of the legal explanation and jargon, there was a district court judge who ruled that one of the drugs that Ohio was using in our lethal injection method was likely unconstitutional because there was new research and there were new opinions from doctors that were given at trial that said that this drug caused pulmonary edema, which is basically like drowning, and one of the physicians said that it caused the person who's being executed to feel like they were being waterboarded, which is torture, which then the judge reasoned that it was likely would be found to be cruel and unusual punishment, which is unconstitutional. And so hearing that, Governor DeWine commuted the sentence of the gentleman who was scheduled to be executed on January 12th of this year. And he told the Department of Corrections that he didn't feel comfortable executing people knowing that there was a good shot that we were torturing people if we were executing them using our current drug protocol. So he said, try to find a different execution method and see if there's anything else viable that we could do. And so that's kind of where we've been since January. The Department of Corrections has not given a whole lot of public information about how close they are to finding another alternative method, how actively they're looking for the alternative method. I think they are definitely searching, and I'll get into some of the reasons why. It's obvious that they're trying to find something, but haven't been super successful in doing that. So in March, Governor DeWine delayed 3 executions of the next people to be executed. And in April, so the media played somewhat of a role in this by talking about when they were trying to figure out what's happening with the drugs and what's happening with the Department of Rehab and Corrections, and are they actually trying to find something, to find another execution method. The question of how Ohio was getting its drugs in the first place kind of came up. And the dispatch did, I'm not sure how much of the information had been public knowledge before, but in April they started publishing some investigations about the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services was driving someone to the correctional facility to pick up the drugs and take them back to the death chamber. And so essentially what that means is that the companies who were supplying the drugs that were being used for executions didn't know that their drugs were going to the death chamber because the death chamber wasn't ordering them. The Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services was ordering them to pick up. And so that isn't good because a lot of these companies who are supplying the drug, which is midazolam, the drug that's in question right now, they refuse to sell drugs to be used for executions because it's not the listed purpose of the drug and it's not in the company's mission to help preserve life and to improve the condition of people's life. And a lot of these companies are also have European connections or are based in Europe, and most all European countries don't have the death penalty. So we're kind of an outlier in that respect. So where we are now with all of this and how this has kind of played out is that a lot of the drug suppliers in Ohio have told Governor DeWine and have made it known to the administration that if their drugs are being used in executions, that they'll stop supplying any drugs to the state. And so Governor DeWine is concerned that if that were to happen, then people who are on Medicare, Medicaid, everyone in the prison population wouldn't be able to get drugs, period. And so I think part of it is Governor DeWine has said that he kind of dodges the question a lot of times when people ask him, does this mean that Ohio's on its way to becoming an abolition state? And I think he's kind of indicated that maybe, and I'm extrapolating, but maybe he wants to say yes, but the legislature is red, and what that might look like is, I think it's a real possibility right now, given the roadblocks. And so I think there's a good chance that maybe he's just hoping that enough roadblocks come up that he doesn't have to make the decision himself, doesn't have to really answer that question himself. And Governor DeWine and the legislature are playing this game of kicking the question, obviously, back and forth to each other, saying it's the legislature who has to decide, it's the governor who has to decide. And so where we are right now, oh, and I also don't want to forget to mention that in July, you might have heard that the Trump administration announced that they will be resuming federal executions, which is a big deal because we haven't had an execution on the federal level since 2003. There are only 62 inmates on federal death row. And so compared to the hundreds and in some states thousands of people on death row, we're not talking about a huge population. But I think the federal government, the first scheduled execution for the federal government is on December 9th of this year, and then there are 5 scheduled through, I think, January. So they're very quick back to back, but the federal government hasn't said too much about how vetted their protocol is, their lethal injection protocol, and if they would even be able to, if they haven't performed an execution in 2003, I'm not sure really how viable that is that we would have one on December 9th. And so I know there's a lot of opposition, and I think there's a really good chance that that litigation will be taken up and maybe drag itself long enough that nothing will happen in December, but I'm definitely not on the Hill, and I don't know enough to say about whether how likely it is that that would happen in December. Given all of this, Governor DeWine said last week that there won't be any more executions in 2019 because we still can't find a viable lethal injection option. So total, he has granted 8 reprieves this year. And it's not necessarily 8 different people, so he pushed back some executions to later this year, and then he postponed them again. So for instance, Keith Hennis was scheduled to be executed in February, and then he pushed it back to September. And then when September rolled around, he pushed it back to later next year. So it's not like 8 separate cases, if that makes sense. But the first execution is scheduled for January of 2020. Again, I don't think that's super likely, given the fact that the year is winding down and we still don't really have anything viable. But there's a lot of things to be pessimistic about, and I think we're given this small glimmer of hope in the death penalty realm right now and in the criminal justice realm. And Governor DeWine has really surprised a lot of people about being so adamant about not wanting to go forward with executions, even when the judge who ruled that it might be unconstitutional, he didn't really say. Governor DeWine could have probably ignored the comments that he made because that's kind of all they were. It wasn't necessarily an official ruling that our method was unconstitutional. So running with that hope, along with the fact that it is really special that we all of a sudden have a lot of people coming forward, notable public figures in Ohio coming forward saying, we actually are having second thoughts about the death penalty too. And those people include former Governor Bob Taft. He wrote an op-ed, I believe in the Dispatch, maybe. Ted Strickland had made a few comments. Judge Paul Pfeiffer has has made remarks, and he actually wrote Ohio's death penalty statute back when it was established in the 70s, and he now is against the death penalty, and he has been for a little bit of time. It's not just with DeWine. And Speaker Householder, Larry Householder is the Speaker of the Ohio House, came out and said, I don't really know how I feel about this either. He didn't necessarily say that he is opposed to the death penalty, but we have a governor and a Speaker of the House right now who are both kind of not in a place where they feel adamantly that this is something we need to pursue. So I feel like the ball is really in our court as citizens and as activists to give them a reason to act on what small uncertainty they might have. Governor DeWine has, I think in not so many words, attributed his opposition to being pro-life and to seeing the inconsistencies in, not wanting abortions to happen, but executing people. And he ran on his faith, I think, in a lot of ways during the election. So I think he's looking to the faith community to kind of back him up. IJPC works on the death penalty in a lot of different ways. We have a death penalty committee that meets monthly. It's small, but mighty, and we've been around since the first execution started in 1999, and we've been a presence at every execution since 1999. We go to Lucasville and hold a vigil there. We do educational presentations on college campuses and talk to students about why the death penalty is unfair, the racial biases, the county disparities, the other geographic disparities. And then we also have a pen pal program. If you're interested in signing up for that, you can write someone who is currently or was formerly on Ohio's death row. And you actually now can email people, and you don't have to write actual letters. So if that's what's been holding you back all this time, you can send an email. And I'll have some flyers in the back. But on December 10th, we are going to have a holiday get-together for all the people who are involved in our anti-death penalty program. And I think we'll have some really exciting updates. It'll be falling right after the potential federal execution. And we'll be writing holiday cards to inmates, and we'll have cookies, and it'll just be a good way to get to know other activists in that world if you think that's something you might be passionate about. So I have talked longer than I planned to. I will pass it off to Hazel.
Okay, hi. My name is Hazel Bell. I am a student at University of Cincinnati, and I am a part of IJPC's program called YES. It stands for Youth Educating Society. We are a group of students, both high school and college students, who our goal is to educate the community about immigration issues. So that is why I'm here today, to educate you all. Mostly it's just a quick update on DACA. So DACA, just a refresher, it stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And it was an executive order that, that President Obama pushed through in 2012. And what DACA did is it gave a certain demographic of children who came to the United States and have mostly lived here their whole lives, don't really know any other countries, gave those children the ability to be free from deportation and also work and go to school here in the United States. DACA cost about like $500 a year to keep up, and it was definitely more of a Band-Aid than an actual fix to the problem, but it definitely saved a lot of people from having to fear about where their situations were going to be. So DACA went through a little bit of a roller coaster since Trump was elected and put into office. So what happens, DACA was an executive order taken away by Jeff Sessions. The courts decided that taking it away was unconstitutional, so they pushed it back. The applications were open for a little while, and now it is at the Supreme Court. And we are very excited that it's in the Supreme Court because very, very little makes it to the Supreme Court. We're excited, but we're also a little scared because there are only a few ways that this could go. So one way is nothing could happen. could be nothing at all. The Supreme Court could decide that none of the United States courts can look at DACA or decide that the decision to rescind it was constitutional or do anything to it until the Trump administration is over. And then they could also say, yes, the decision to rescind DACA was unconstitutional, so we will get DACA back, and it will definitely be a victory for young undocumented people. Or they could say, no, it was constitutional and DACA will go away forever. But YES's goal and also IJPC's goal is not just for DACA, it is for the DREAM Act. So right now in the Senate, the Dream and Promise Act is about to be introduced, hopefully. It passed through the House. And the Dream and Promise Act is a step towards IJPC's goal for immigration, which is comprehensive immigration reform, changing the whole system so that it's equitable and fair for people to come into the United States. So the key facts about the Dream and Promise Act. One is the most inclusive immigration bill yet. It includes a large number of people who did not get protections under DACA, which is important because DACA only applied to a certain amount of people. And it also majorly hoped for is it provided a pathway to citizenship, the Dream and Promise Act. For immigrant use, people with temporary protected status and deferred enforced departure. So immigrant youth who would be able to apply for conditional permanent residency status and fulfill education, work, or military requirements, they can apply to become citizens, which is huge. Another thing which was also under DACA would be access to in-state tuition and federal financial aid. And another really big thing that we were surprised about was access to relief for deported community members. So if certain individuals who qualify were deported, they could come back to the United States and reunite with family members, restart their lives again. And so, yeah, in conclusion, that is the Dream and Promise Act is what we are hoping for in the long run. But in the meantime, DACA the decision will come to the Supreme Court next week on November 12th. YES and IJPC, we are hosting a vigil. We're going to have information at the back with all the death penalty pamphlets. All right. Yeah.
Do you have any questions about either of the topics?
Again, off topic. One of you works on human trafficking.
So we are a really short, not short staff, but we're a small staff. So I'm one of the program managers, and I manage our anti-death penalty program and our peace and nonviolence program. Samantha, who is not here tonight, she manages our immigration program. So she manages the YES program that Hazel's a part of, and then she also manages the human trafficking program. But if you have any basic questions, I might be able to answer some.
Can you give a broad outline of what kind of stuff you do in that area?
Yeah, so she works a lot with a coalition of folks, and I don't want to say all of their names because I will inevitably get them wrong or leave people out. But one of the biggest things that she has worked to get together this year is a media toolkit that talks about how it's geared toward reporters or educators or students who are writing about human trafficking, but mostly for the media. So that they can talk about victims and talk about human trafficking in a way that is correct and informed. And so she's been seeing some small changes in our local reporting that I know have made her happy. And I think she does work as well as our immigration program. She works in schools and with community groups to talk about human trafficking and what that means in Hamilton County. If you're interested in more, I can get you her email.
Maybe. Go ahead. All right, this may be, maybe a dumb question, but how does one know what one of the death pens feel like? As you had mentioned, one of them feels like being vulnerable.
Right.
Like, how do you know that feels like if you're not on the death penalty?
Right. So So the witnesses who were there for the at the court hearing, the Judge Mers, where he made that statement, they were experts, and so the midazolam that they give the inmates is in an excess amount of what they would give during a normal procedure. So it's supposed to be, it is a sedative, but it is not a sedative that stops the body from feeling pain. So you still feel pain when that drug is taken. And patients who receive that in a normal setting, they still will report, and doctors know that they will still feel whatever is happening to them, so they usually use a different type of drug. They know that a pulmonary edema, your lungs fill up with liquid and you drown, essentially, so that I think is where the waterboarding came from. So the third drug, so the first drug is midazolam. I'm not a doctor, but this is what I've come to know. Midazolam is the first drug that is a sedative. The second drug is a drug that causes paralysis, so it stops your lungs from contracting, and then the third drug stops the heart. And so the person who's being executed feels all of that, and so that was like what the testimony was. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have a question. Why don't they have a drug that like puts the person unconscious and then executes them? Why?
That's what they're trying.
I don't know all of the ins and outs of like how the medicine would work, but what I do know is that midazolam is interesting because essentially Ohio is and most other states are using this same drug. We're not the only state who's going through this litigation process right now. But the problem with a lot of the drugs is that you can't experiment on inmates, right? You can't experiment on humans constitutionally because we say that that's not something that's humane. And so doctors who take the Hippocratic Oath do not want to give their services, or are essentially barred from giving their services, to say, let's run a study and find out the best way to kill a human being, right? So that's not, we don't have that scientific knowledge, but we do have these trials about certain drugs where we're litigating them through the courts to say, what are the sensations that a person would feel? And a lot of times I do think that the doctors can't honestly say for sure because they don't administer those drugs in those quantities for those purposes, and they don't want to. So, I'm sorry?
I said it seems math works pretty well.
Yeah, I'm not, so like,
I've had surgery before. Of course, they knocked me out totally. And if I had never woken up, I never would have.
Right.
I would have been none the wiser.
I mean, I'm not sure. I can't guess, but I really have no idea. You could definitely do some research on it. I'm not sure. I know that the drug manufacturers and the doctors are the two biggest reasons why that wouldn't happen. So I don't know if, I don't think there's an anesthesiologist on staff, right?
Yeah,
And so, is the state going to pay for an anesthesiologist, or?
I would think that part of a mission of an organization like yours will be not just to try to prevent the death penalty, but also try to ensure that if it is actually administered, that it be not cruel and unusual, because you wouldn't want to prevent torture
Right.
and suffering. And so I would think that you would maybe advocate also saying, why don't you completely knock someone out before you execute them?
Well, I don't know of anyone who's making any of those arguments. I haven't ever heard of other drugs that would work better, because I'm guessing there's a reason why that's not feasible, since that's not something that people are proposing. If that makes sense.
You right there, you've been.
If you're, I assume your organization is anti-death penalty. Has your organization ever thought of a different approach? I know Mike DeWine was a former prosecutor. He prosecuted death penalty cases,
Right.
and in Texas, a lot of prosecutors run for office on that.
Yep.
Has your organization ever thought of seeking legislation where making it illegal for prosecutors to seek higher office, or to use their death penalty record in running for office, or use that? That's just very morbid
Yeah.
thing to do.
Yeah, we We have looked into and are still kind of in the process of working on the cost side of things from a county perspective. So just some general background is the death penalty is a state, the state of Ohio administers the death penalty, but it's sought out on the county level. So the county prosecutors are all responsible for choosing whether or not to seek a death penalty case, which is why there are 75% of the counties in Hamilton County have never had someone from their county be executed and are not actively and as frequently seeking death penalty cases. But all the taxpayers are paying for them when there's only this small percentage of counties that are seeking out the death penalty. So we have looked at, and like I said, we are part of the geographical problem that our organization has is we're not in Columbus. So the like being in an office every day lobbying is something that we don't have a whole lot of capacity to do, but we've looked at on the county level what we can try to do. And we're in the process of doing some of those things right now, and we haven't really been we're still working on them behind the scenes. So I started in January, and before me we had a lot of religious people in my spot who kind of approached it in a more religious sense, and I think right now, if we're working on Governor DeWine, his ears seem to perk up most at appeals to religion and to why it's immoral rather than why it is in practice not.
At the beginning of his political career, he ran on this death penalty cases.
As AG?
And my point in that is like religion, when it tries to, or religious politicians, when they try to get rid of Planned Parenthood, they gerrymander basically around Planned Parenthood,
Right.
saying you have to have residency requirements. So a lot of the prosecutors like to run on their death penalty cases. So if you eliminate the fact that they can run on their death penalty cases, they're essentially gerrymandering them to where they have less interest in
Well,
prosecuting death
that's
penalty
why you
cases.
be restricting their freedom of speech, because, you know, if you're going to apply for a job, you tell us what you can do this job.
part of the issue too is like IJPC is not political, but if you know Hamilton County, you know how long that prosecutor has been in office, and I think a lot of people don't know like what the prosecutor does and what they have control of. So whenever I go to college campuses, I talk a lot about the prosecutor's job, and it's important to know what they do because we vote for the prosecutors.
Does anybody ever follow up with the person who's on death row who had a date that they knew they would die and then they're reprieved? It seems like that would be horrible.
Yeah,
And to have that done 2 or 3 times,
right.
does anybody follow up to see how that affects them?
That's a good question. I think that's where the activist community comes in. It depends on the inmate's level of like wanting the support from other people. IJPC usually tries to play a role in like communicating with people, and I know so we work a lot with Ohioans to stop executions, which is located in Columbus, and they kind of help us stay in the know with what's going on in the General Assembly. But there are also other organizations like the Death Penalty Action Group. They're in constant communication with a lot of the inmates. So, I mean, yeah, I'm not sure that like checking on their mental and spiritual well-being is something that the state does or people do.
Yeah.
If we're permitted to ask off-base questions, that kind of thing, it occurs to me that if you were to asphyxiate the people who are to be put to death on nitrous oxide or laughing gas, now, would that not, they would be dead and they would die happy too?
You're such a caring person.
Okay, so why don't they put people to death with laughing gas? You know you can suffocate on laughing gas. Why don't they put people to death?
But your purpose,
I think they're trying to stop
your existence is to stop it. And right now, your best avenue that you're going
Right.
after is find other ways to stop this, you would also take those
Right.
avenues also.
Right.
Yeah, so it has nothing really to do with the drugs.
It does.
It just
does.
says, this is the only way this is the way we're getting at it right
The
now.
bottom line is, the question that I think that my organization would have and that a lot of activists would have is the whole reason lethal injection was introduced in the first place was to make the death penalty more palatable for Americans. And so now people are talking about, let's just bring back execution by hanging, let's just bring back execution by firing squad or gas chamber. And so we're just coming back to this point where we were before and tried to make ourselves feel better with the fact that we were carrying out murder. And so now how worth it is to keep fighting, because inevitably when there will be a roadblock, there will be a legal roadblock, no matter which avenue you take. And so it just seems like a fight that's not really worth it.
Firing squad actually seems to be the least cruel.
Some people, so,
Unusual.
well, inmates can,
I'm sorry,
No, it's.
How many
No, I don't
states
think
actually
it's-
have
that's-
Remember the movie Logan?
that's a good question. So,
You guys?
I can Google that right
oh, I know the answer.
now. You know the answer?
Yeah.
Perfect.
So technically, there are 29 states who currently have the death penalty as an option. So that is like what you will Google if you Google how. That's what will come up if you Google how many states have the death penalty. But there are only 13 states who have had an execution in the last 5 years.
Okay, follow up. If we do away with the death penalty, what happens to the people on death row? And what is the financial implications? Is it cheaper to keep them in life as opposed to all the litigation that goes on?
So that's a good question. So since life without parole became an option in Ohio and a lot of other states, that has been like the life without parole argument has been huge, pushed by activists, and it has some controversies. But I would venture to say that most people who are on death row, their case would probably have to go through a review process again, but they would likely be sentenced to life without parole. And a life without parole case is 3 times, I believe it's 3 times cheaper than a death penalty case. And we're doing some research on the cost in our office right now, but the reason why is because of the length of the appeals process that a death penalty case takes. And a lot of people, including the Hamilton County prosecutor and other elected officials, come back and say, I think Trump just made a statement about this this summer, but like, we need to shorten the process, right? You shouldn't be, the average length of time for a person on Ohio's death row to be sitting on death row is 17 years. Why is it taking so long? We need to shorten the process. Yes, but if we abide under the Constitution and we say that we're going to give someone the fullest extent of the law and the benefit of the doubt, people who are sentenced to death have more appeals afforded to them because it's the only decision that is final in the entire criminal justice system. And 4% of people who are sentenced to die are found to have later been innocent. And with the advent of DNA testing, we know that now. And so I think to say there's a 4% chance that this person is innocent, but we're not going to give you the full extent of your appeals is something that we can't do. 17 years is a really long time to be litigating something. And it is a lot of money. It's a lot of money.
It seems like a no-brainer. They can't figure out a drug to have. It's cruel or immoral, unethical, and it's cheaper.
And I always say, like, morals aside, I clearly, like, do not think it's moral, and I think a lot of religions would support that as well, but just practically it doesn't make sense.
I think a lot of people think, there's a perception among people who support that penalty that because it's final, that it is in fact cheaper, but they don't realize it's not.
Right.
And that's the reason why I think somebody from your organization pointed out about the geography. Most of the counties where people are sentenced to death in Ohio are large urban counties where they have lots of money.
Right.
If you're in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, you don't have the fund.
And it's not
And to be clear, we're not advocating, like, the drug issue is not part of our stance at all. That's just like the update of where Ohio is at, and so we feel like this is a really good time for us to make it known that there's a large base of people who would support any legislator or governor who wanted to say no more. And so we're not tied to any of, like, medical anything. We're just trying to say even louder that we oppose the death penalty. So.
Why are
does
judges,
Kentucky-
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Why does Kentucky have, this isn't a problem in,
Kentucky
Yeah.
hasn't had an execution in over 10 years.
well, then, good for us.
Yeah.
Well, why are we better than Ohio on this issue?
Whoa.
I am not a Kentucky expert, and I don't know why you haven't had an execution in 10 years. That's a good question, though.
I think one aspect of the death penalty that most people don't think about is the death penalty on a criminal is also a form of scapegoating for the community and for the people that created that person that committed those crimes. A lot of criminals are made, and when you have death, and when you put that criminal to death, those people in that community don't have to explain anymore what happened, what they did. A lot of people don't think of it in that aspect. So
Is that really closure though? If
yeah,
they
people
keep
don't ask
coming
questions
up
in that
and
community.
keep
Everybody thinks of
appealing.
the revenge aspect for the victim, but
Yep.
also it's a form of scapegoating for that community that created that person too. So-
Really quick before I know it's getting late. Does anyone have questions for Hazel? I know we've gotten in the thick of it now.
Why are judges and prosecutors so unwilling to entertain the thought, even with a lot of evidence, that the person is innocent?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an answer for that?
I think, and this is just like my personal thoughts, I think it could vary by case to case depending on the degree that there were errors or mistakes, and I think a lot of it is prosecutor and police culture, and what that means. Even when we say that someone is innocent, the state never issues an apology, and the state never tells that person that they did anything wrong. And so I think we have a real problem with saying our criminal justice system made a mistake. And I think it starts there, and you can see the toxicity of that through a lot of that, especially when they're a high-profile case, like a murder. Obviously, people want to find a scapegoat or find someone to make sure that justice is. Thank you so much for having us both.
Yay!